simpler triple camera module on the OnePlus 8. I really like the camera module on the OnePlus 70 and I wish they kept it the same on this phone as well. Design of the camera module is not the only thing that has changed. OnePlus has shuffled around the cameras as well. For starters, on the OnePlus 8, we don't get a 2x telephoto lens. Instead, we get a 2 megapixel sensor with f2.4 aperture and a macro lens. 70 used the ultra-wide camera for taking macro shots, which is not the case anymore. Speaking of the ultra-wide camera, thankfully it is still present on this new phone. This camera gets a 16 megapixel sensor with f2.2 aperture and a 14mm lens. This field of view is wider than the 17mm lens on the OnePlus 70. And finally, the main camera retains the same 48 megapixel Sony IMX586 sensor as on the OnePlus 70. But the aperture is now much narrower at f1.75 against f1.6 on 70. Lens optics also shifted from 7p on the OnePlus 70 to 6p on the OnePlus 8. It still gets optical image stabilization, but it is only put to work while shooting images, and all videos are stabilized just with the help of electronic stabilization. With the primary camera, you can shoot 4K videos at 30 or 60 fps, 1080p videos at 30, 60 and 240 fps, and 720p videos at 480 fps. With the wide camera, you can shoot 4K and 1080p videos in 30 fps. At the front, we get the same 16 megapixel Sony IMX471 sensor like on the OnePlus 70, but the aperture is now much narrower to f2.45. This has got to be the narrowest aperture on any selfie camera that I have used in the last couple of years. Interface of the camera has also changed a bit. You get lens selection button above the shutter button like on most phones, and you can swipe to the left or right for switching modes. Now the option to change the resolution while taking images is not just available in the Pro mode. You can just tap on this icon at the top to switch between 48 and 12 megapixel mode. Right next to it, there is the option to switch to the macro camera. Settings has been moved onto the top right corner, and to change or even check the video resolution, you will have to go deep into this settings menu. Pro mode is pretty much same as before. You can change all settings like ISO, white balance, shutter speed, focus and exposure according to the scene or according to your liking. It lets you shoot raw images, and you can even have a histogram right on the viewfinder. Range for ISO in the Pro mode is from 100 to 3200, and the range for shutter speed is from 1/8000th of a second all the way up to 30 seconds. While the camera specs don't sound like an upgrade over the OnePlus 70, maybe image signal processor on the Snapdragon 865 will help this phone deliver better results. My OnePlus 8 is running on the latest version of Oxygen OS, which is available at the time of uploading this video. Let us start with the daytime images. We have been looking at the images from this sensor since the OnePlus 7, and as you can see, it is getting better and better with the details thanks to the image signal processing capabilities of the new Snapdragon processor. There are plenty of details in these images, but I think the contrast is a bit on the heavier side, making some of the images appear a bit darker than they should. Most of the images look good from the primary camera, and if you are getting this phone, I think you will be happy with the primary camera's daylight performance. These indoor daytime images also turned out to be pretty good from the primary camera. OnePlus seems to have worked a lot on getting the colors right, because in almost all of these shots, colors turned out to be exactly how the actual scene was. There is just a bit more contrast in these images as I have mentioned before, but they still look good for the most part. And we don't see the weird green or magenta tint that we saw in some of the images from the OnePlus 7 series phones, so thumbs up to OnePlus for getting it right this time. In terms of dynamic range, I think OnePlus needs to work a bit on getting it even better. In some of the shots like this, it does well to bring up the details from the shadows, but it fails to preserve the details in the highlights. You can see something similar in this image. It did bring up a lot of details from the darker parts, but if we zoom in, we see that it did not preserve any of the details in the brighter areas, and this is with the ultra short HDR mode turned on. Now in this shot, it did well to bring up the details in the building and preserve the details in the leaves despite of the sun being behind them. But the overall image still needs some work. Here is how it could have looked if the image processing did a slightly better job. In this image, it did well with the sun, but it barely brought back any details in the building. I think there is potential in this sensor and the ISP to do better, but OnePlus just needs to tweak the software a bit so it can take better advantage of all the raw data that this sensor captures. Before we move on to the close-up shots, here's a quick focusing speed test of the primary camera. This is a 4K 30fps video, and as you can see, it is pretty quick at switching the focus from a far to near object and then back again. If you remember, on previous OnePlus phones, there was a pretty big fall in the focusing capabilities when I switched from 30 to 60 fps. I think that was because they were using OIS for stabilizing 60 FPS videos. Now they have switched to using EIS for keeping all these videos stable. So even while shooting at 4K 60 FPS, the focusing is just as quick as it is while shooting 30 FPS videos. Faster and accurate focusing means we get to take amazing close-up shots like this one. The subject is in perfect sharp focus, and since it is a large sensor and it has f1.75 aperture, the background, as you can see, gets a very nice optical blur. Now since 48 megapixel sensor is large for a smartphone, as you get closer to the subject, plane of focus starts getting narrower, making it harder to keep things in focus. Due to this, you can also see some artifacting in the things that are just out of focus. If you want to get even closer to your subject, there is a dedicated macro camera on this phone. Normally, I am defending the lower resolution macro cameras on most smartphones because given right conditions, you can take really good macro shots even with 2 megapixel macro cameras. But the one on the OnePlus 8 has to be one of the worst out there. First of all, you can't get too close to your subject, and even when the focus is set, there just aren't too many details in the subject no matter how well lit the subject is. I have found a workaround for this. You can use the digital zoom on the primary camera to get even better macro shots than the macro lens. Since it is a bigger sensor and has a wider aperture than the macro lens, these digitally zoomed images look much better than the ones from the macro camera. And there is also a lot less noise in these images compared to the ones that are actually shot with the macro lens. The ultra-wide lens on the OnePlus 8 is even wider than the one on the OnePlus 70, and it lets you capture so much more of the scene when compared to the normal lens. Unlike the 70, we don't have a telephoto lens on this phone, but you can still take 2x digitally zoomed images. These ones are not as sharp as the ones from the telephoto lens, but when there is ample light, these zoomed in images get the job done. Colors and white balance are a bit inconsistent when you switch from normal to wide lens. Overall color tones from the primary camera are naturally warm, but the wide camera tends to lean on capturing cooler color tones. OnePlus needs to work on the software a bit to match these two lenses as closely as possible in terms of white balance and color temperature. We all know this by now, that the wide lens is not as sharp or as detailed as the primary camera, and most of its images are softer, especially towards the edges. This is very apparent while taking close-up or indoor shots with these lenses. But for outdoor or far away shots, you won't notice the lower image quality unless you zoom way in. All images from the primary camera that we saw till now were 12 megapixel pixel bin ones. But if you wish to take high resolution images, you can switch to the 48 megapixel mode. When you make the switch to 48 megapixels, it says that this mode offers high resolution and captures details in well-lit scene. And that 12 megapixel mode offers better dynamic range, and this is the recommended mode for most of your shots. When you take 48 megapixel images in ample light, it does hold on to more details than the 12 megapixel ones. But you will have to zoom in 5 to 6 times to notice that slight difference in the image quality. 48 megapixel images are also huge in terms of file size, so it is always best to stick to the default 12 megapixel mode for most of your shots. Portrait mode on smartphones is the best way to make your images stand out and make them feel like they were taken with a DSLR camera and an expensive prime lens. OnePlus 8 does a very good job with these portrait shots. I think edge detection needs quite a bit of refinement, but the shots look good for the most part. This time, faces are in perfect sharp focus and the background gets a very nice natural looking blur. The dynamic range seems to be amazing while taking these shots. It might be a bit aggressive at times, but it does a good job for the most part. I just hope they make the camera deliver these kind of results more consistently. Edge detection is definitely not perfect while taking these portrait shots, but I'm sure OnePlus can fix this with software update as they did with some of their previous smartphones. There is again a bit more contrast in these images, but I also like that the subjects are sharp and detailed in all of these shots. Let us move on to images shot in indoors, artificial and lower lighting conditions. Now the f1.75 aperture and optical image stabilization on the main camera lets it keep on capturing pleasing looking images even as the light goes down. This phone makes the indoor lighting images look really good. There is some noise in the darker parts of these images, but that is to be expected out of any smartphone when the light is this low. Nightscape mode helps it reduce that noise and capture much sharper images. As we zoom in, look at how much more details the image with the nightscape mode managed to get in the shot. OIS on the main camera helps the shutter remain open for a longer time and capture more light, which when combined with the nightscape mode gives us such good images. I took this set of images when there was barely any light around, and look at the difference that the nightscape mode makes. Now you can use the Pro mode and get even better results with longer exposure, but that might require a tripod or something similar to keep the phone steady, and some knowledge of things like shutter speed, ISO, exposure and so on. And trust me, Most people don't want to mess with these things every time they want to take a decent shot. So for them, nightscape mode works like a charm. Considering the light available at the scene, these images look really good on their own. But how do they look when compared to some of the competing smartphones? Well, that is a question for another video. If you want to see me compare the cameras on this phone with others like the OnePlus 70, iPhone 11 and the Mi 10, make sure you are subscribed to the channel and have the notifications turned on. That brings us to the front-facing camera. OnePlus has been using the same sensor for the selfie camera since quite a few generations, even though its performance has not been anything out of ordinary. It is a decent shooter, but the sharpness and detail levels don't really match up to the level of other front-facing cameras in the market. I have said this in OnePlus 70's camera review as well, that I am not talking about increasing the megapixel count on this selfie camera, but OnePlus needs to really improve the image processing for this camera. Edge detection is good while taking portrait selfies, and since the background is blurred out, subjects appear a bit sharper in these portrait selfies. It does really well even when you have multiple people in the shot, but the dynamic range takes a big hit while you are taking these portrait selfies. While I think OnePlus has got a lot right with the rear-facing cameras on this phone, I think they really need to put in more efforts in this front-facing camera. Here's a video from the front-facing camera of the OnePlus 8. You can see how it handles the overall colors of the scene, exposure, and stabilization when I'm walking around with it. Coming to the video. Just like with previous OnePlus phones, OnePlus 8 lets you shoot 4K videos in up to 60 FPS, and these videos are amazingly smooth because they are stabilized via electronic stabilization. While the stability and dynamic range is really good in these videos, overall quality of the videos doesn't seem to be the best. 1080p videos don't have too many details in them. 4K videos do look good, and if you're looking to get this phone for shooting vlogs, you can get some amazingly smooth 4K footage out of the primary camera on the back. There is not a lot to complain about these videos, but they are not as smooth or as good looking as videos from some of the other flagship smartphones. You can take 240fps slow motion videos in 1080p resolution and 480fps slow motion videos in 720p resolution. When you shoot slow motion videos in plenty of light, they look really good. After looking at all these image and video samples, I can definitely say that OnePlus has managed to give us a decent set of cameras on this OnePlus 8. These images are not mind-blowingly great, but other than the disappointing macro camera, there is not a lot to complain about. I have not compared its images with other smartphones yet, so we don't know where does it stand against the competition. But on its own, I think the OnePlus 8 has got a set of decent cameras on its back. Now all that OnePlus needs to do is tweak it a bit with software updates to make it even better, especially the selfie camera. I am really excited to test these cameras against the ones on the OnePlus 70 and see if we really get enough of an upgrade in terms of cameras. What are your thoughts about the cameras on the OnePlus 8? And based on its camera and the images that you saw, would you choose it over the OnePlus 70? Let me know in the comments. If this video helped you and you are planning to get this phone, I will really appreciate if you get it from the